All right, welcome to the Pangburn Podcast. This is Travis Pangburn. I am out on the coast of Alaska somewhere around the, what's it called? Glacier Bay, I believe. And I am joined by a very special guest today, Mr. Lee Vale. I've come to know him as like the superstar nature dude of Alaska. And I've gotten to know him well, and I'm really happy to be talking to him today. And thanks for coming on, Lee.
Well, thank you for having me on, Travis. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So why don't we just start off by talking a bit about what got you interested in the nature of Alaska?
Well, like most good things, it seems like it was an accident. I used to be a firefighter paramedic, grew up in Alaska, though, out in nature on a commercial fishing boat with my mom for most of my life. And I decided, because I got beat up so much growing up and had a lot of kids and people my age pass away because commercial fishing was dangerous, I wanted to be an EMT and figure out how to help somebody if I needed to. And then I became a EMT too at 19, mobile intensive care paramedic at 20, and then I ruptured 2 discs at 21 on the fire department up in Anchorage. So I kind of switched gears and I decided to become a park ranger with Glacier Bay National Park. Search and rescue ranger to begin with, went back to school and somehow got into being a naturalist, got a master's in cultural anthropology and a bachelor's in history, and spent 12 years as a park ranger learning from some of the best scientists in the world.
Right.
So it was used to be one of the best places to be because all the cruise ships that go into Glacier Bay, they get a head tax, and all that money, just like any good American government agency, if you don't spend it, you lose it. So it didn't matter what you wanted to do research in, you had unlimited funding if you got there, and so a lot of the good scientists, you got to go out with them, which was pretty fun.
Yeah. Wow. So there's a lot there to delve into. Why don't you tell us about some of your experiences in rescue? You said you had worked with rescue for a while, right?
Yeah, so like I said, it was an accident that got me into it. I thought Glacier Bay National Park, crown jewel of the national park system, that this park would have, tons of damsels in distress needing rescuing, and I was a shy kid from a boat in Alaska.
So you were in it for the chicks, is what you're telling me?
Yeah, I didn't know how to talk to them at that point. I was, I'd stumble and stutter, and so I figured, well, why talk when you can do action? And not really, that's just a joke in my head. But I got there, and they told me that all the cruise ships have doctors, and so they needed an ALS medic for paperwork, for legalities. They didn't really need one to do any rescuing. So I might do 1 case a year, 2 cases a year, but for the most part, I did safety presentations. And I tell people about how to stay safe with bears, how to stay safe boating in a place where you get 25-foot differentials in tide. And that somehow segued into being a naturalist the next year, after my first year. And so it was all kind of by accident.
Right. Yeah, let's, you know what? Everyone probably is interested in hearing us talk about bears. I mean, it's one thing we have in common. I grew up in the Kootenay region of British Columbia, and we both grew up around bears and bear safety. I mean, in schools, a lot of places around the world, like bear safety isn't a thing, but bear safety was a constant thing in school that we were being reminded of because we're walking with packed lunches, sometimes with our tuna fish sandwiches, like
through bear country.
Country. And, and I mean, you can get into more like how good bears sense of smell and it really is. But like, yeah, what are your experiences generally with bears growing up, and then we'll get into more of the actual nature aspect of that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, like you, it sounds like the size of your town is similar to mine. I mean, there's only 500 people, and the joke is a drinking town with a fishing problem. But it's right off the coast, actually, from the ship here, about 15 miles. And we're outnumbered by bears, and the same thing, you walk a couple miles through the forest to school, and your parents thought it was a good idea to have jerky or something that has a good scent to it.
Yeah.
It's kind of amazing none of us got picked off. But
and you must have had a lot of meat in your bag, right?
Yes. Like smoked salmon, regular salmon, and you had your poke, depending on what your parents wanted to feed you that day.
Yeah.
Salmon typically being at the top of the list.
And would your and just as a bit of a side question, would your parents arm you in any way? Like, were you carrying a gun to school, or did you have bear spray, or was there even bother carrying like a 10-inch blade? Or
no, I think I don't know if the parents did it on purpose and they said, hey, if the kid survives, the kid survives.
Yeah.
It's Darwin's theory,
evolution. Yeah.
But looking back on it, I didn't think there was anything wrong with that when I was a kid. I thought it was a grand adventure. Now I'm like, well, I wish they would have told me that a bear might be out there somewhere.
Yeah.
But that being said, there were so many dogs in town, and they weren't ever collared up or leashed. And a lot of dogs had favorite kids, and so they would just kind of escort you to school. I had a half wolf. Her name was Nikki, and she would just kind of pick me up and take me to school. She'd hide out in the snow in the woods somewhere until I got done, and then she'd walk me back again. So I thought it was just because she wanted to hang out, but it seemed like also if there had been bears out there, she probably would let me know too. So
yeah, definitely. I grew up with a huge golden retriever, like oversized golden retriever, and bears didn't want to be anywhere around him. Especially my dad would during the summer would shave him like a lion, leave a mane and a tuft on the tail. So I think bears were probably more confused than anything. And
yeah, a little freaked
didn't
out.
like the barking. But yeah, that's and I was just thinking. I remember going mushroom picking, pine mushroom picking. It's something that people do where I'm from, and you can make a little bit of money doing it, and it's fun. It's like treasure hunting, but you're out in the bush. And I remember coming really close to a grizzly up there, and all I had was like a 5-inch blade in my pocket, and I was like, I was kind of thinking to myself, why did I even bring this? I guess if I came face to face with a cougar or something, then it might be useful. But just the size of that animal and just the pure force, it just it knew I was there. It gave me a few little and I just slowly backed down the hill and gave it its space.
Went home and changed your pants right after.
Exactly. Like I was just like, I don't even know if I was probably still in shock. I didn't even, to be honest, I think I did continue picking mushrooms, but that's just the mentality. Thinking of it now, I'm like, what a stupid kid. But did you ever have any like close encounters?
Yeah, I had plenty. Nice thing is that it's so small up here, we don't have food conditioned bears. And so they don't, like down in, say, someplace like Yellowstone National Park, they're so fixated on humans because they know that somewhere around humans or on a human's person is food. Whether it's a candy bar in a car or whether it's going to be, a tuna fish sandwich in a backpack, they start blurring that line between is food, has food is food.
Right.
And that's where things get dangerous. Up here, there's so few people, they don't really know what you are, and so they treat you a lot like another bear. And the first time that I encountered this is I was 17, and when I get pissed off, my favorite thing to get or stressed to get away and just kind of calm down was to go out to a river about 12 miles outside of town called the Seatuck. And it's got all 5 types of salmon. There typically was never anybody there. So I had this little beat-up Chevy Love, and so after high school one day, I don't remember what had happened, but I was just done with it all. I had some of my gear in the back, and I drove out the 12 miles. It was almost dark. I get to the river, and like voila, it was the perfect thing. Nobody else was there. No cars in the parking lot. And I'm like, all right, I feel better already. And I grab my waders, and I grab my pole, and whatever other stuff I'm not thinking of. Put it on me, and off I go, and I hike about a mile up towards twilight. And as dusk is setting, I get my fly rod out, and it's sockeye season, and I catch my first sockeye right off the bat, and I instantly feel better. It's a good day. And I probably caught 2 or 3 more. And I make one last cast, and I catch the biggest of all the sockeye. And all of a sudden I realize, man, it's pretty dark out. Like, it's really dark out. I can't even see this fish that I'm fighting in, and I'm fighting it, and I get it on in, hit it on the head. I never really thought about a couple things until that point. Is that sports fishermen, they have this little hook that you put through the gills of fish, and
right.
You attach it back to your belt so they can drag in the water, and keep cold, and they're not sitting on the bank. Well, I didn't think about, the fact that could be considered bait, too.
Right.
So I was hooking this beautiful, like, 12, 15-pound sockeye onto this belt with a couple of other fish, and in the pitch black, while I'm sitting almost chest deep in water, I hear right in my ear, and I start freaking out. And I instantly go to grab my gun, because I always bring my gun with me,
Yeah.
And I didn't have it. I was too stressed out. I hadn't thought about it. I went to grab my bear spray, which works equally well. Didn't have that either, and I realized that nobody knows where I'm at. I don't got anything to defend myself, and I'm...
So stop there. What kind of gun would you take out with you?
So typically when we go, we've got a 44.
Okay.
A Desert Eagle works too, but basically you're trying to punch through like a 1/4 inch of steel in order to get through like a bear skull if you have to.
Right. So you're not carrying a rifle out there with you. You got. Is it a rifle or is it?
No, if you take a rifle out, typically you'll take out a 12 gauge with slugs.
Right. Yeah.
It's the only thing with stopping.
That's what my
enough.
grandpa mushroom picks with. So.
Yeah, but when you're fishing, it's hard for rifles if you've got all the stuff on to have it slung over your back.
Yeah,
so most people have just the highest caliber pistol that you can get your hands on.
Right. So you have a big fuck off 44.
It's a dirty, hairy 44, absolutely. And
okay, so you hear this terrible sound in your ear.
So I hear this god awful growl, and I swear to God, to the day I die, I'll never forget it. I have this flash to me standing at the pearly gates, and I'm about to try to get my way into heaven. And St. Peter's up there, and he's checking people off. Car crash, all right, cancer, check. What about you? Well, I went out, didn't tell anybody, to a bear river, and I strung 6 salmon to my waist, and I waited until a bear got me. Oh, no, suicide. You're going the other way, buddy.
Yeah, exactly. Or just go sit in the waiting room until I can figure out what to do.
Yeah, we're going to process this one. I'm going to have to bring in a legal team. So anyway, after I'm done having a heart attack, I slowly turn my head over, and in the darkness, about 10 feet away, is this probably 1,000-pound brown bear sitting chest deep in the water, just staring at me. And this fish is wiggling in my hand. And he slaps the water and makes a bigger growl. And I know, I've always grown up being told, don't take a step back because they're creatures that are based off dominance.
Exactly.
I was 17. I couldn't help it. I took a step back,
Yeah.
and he took a bigger one forward, and all of a sudden he was within almost touching distance.
Yeah.
And I didn't know what to do, and that fish wiggled real fast in my hand, and it slipped, and I lost it, and it hit the water, and I grabbed the belt and put it back to my belt, not even thinking about it, with the other fish on it. And my prize sockeye, probably the biggest one I'd ever caught, goes drifting down to this bear, and it grabs it in its mouth, and then it swings and splashes the water. But it did it in a different way, where it's kind of like, get the hell out of here.
Right.
And it felt like, get the hell out of here.
Almost a trade.
Yeah.
Your life for that fish.
Yeah, the prize fish, and it's like, get off my fishing hole and go. And so I don't know what my brain, like how it translated that, but I knew it was pretty sure. So I start taking steps back, and sure enough, it doesn't come after me. It just kind of sits there and watches until I finally hit dry land. And I get up there, and I swear, this bear just kind of looks at me, and he looks like a guy that's smug about just robbing you. He's kind of, yeah, that's right. And he walks off. And watching bears later on, I would come to find out that because they don't know what humans are, they treat you like another bear. And so he did to me what exactly he would have done to a young, upstart, younger bear that was on his fishing hole. If a young bear doesn't drop that fish and doesn't get off his fishing hole right away, then things get real serious. But if he does that, then that's exactly the process that big bear is looking for, and you're safe. And so unwittingly, I saved myself kind of just by being scared and leaving.
And I think it's a good thing that you dropped the prize fish.
Yeah.
Because if you would have gave it the secondhand fish,
He probably would not have been as impressed with it. Nope.
yeah, and you might have offended him.
They're damn smart creatures, so I would probably not be surprised in the least if that's the case. It's amazing. I mean, a lot of indigenous lore is based off of watching direct observation of animals, and the ones that are most intelligent, that have the most humanistic characteristics, end up being bears, wolves, orca, those great mighty predators that oftentimes are not as violent as they seem, but they are a lot more intelligent than we give them credit for. And it's neat to see them like take sphagnum mosses, and they figured out sometime in the beginning of their ancestry how to grind up a certain type of sphagnum moss into a paste when they get into a fight with another bear, and they'll lean on it, and they'll sit on it for an hour or two until it grafts into their wound. And that antiseptic, antibiotic property that sphagnum moss has will clean the wound and keep them from getting infection. And then watching humans 13,000 years ago see this and start using it for wound care for ourselves, that kind of stuff is pretty cool.
Yeah. So how do you think they would have discovered that? Do you think it would have been by well obviously they're passing it down ancestrally, right? But there must be some kind of reaction that they feel when the moss touches them. Do you think so? Or because they're obviously not using it as medicine in the sense that we think of medicine, but or are they? Like, what do you think? What do you think's going on?
Well, that's the thing is we have so many different types of mosses that could just feel good, that could help cover up a wound so it's not exposed to air, so it feels more comfortable to them. However, if you look at it in as far as medicinal history, none of the other mosses have that antiseptic quality to them.
Right.
So it's a huge coincidence that out of all the different mosses that have a different texture and different type of, say, flavor or substance to them, that they're grabbing only the one that has the most property to help them.
Right. I guess what I'm asking is that did one bear in the past sit on the right type of moss when he got his ass scratched or something, and it felt some kind of fizzing or some kind of reaction that moss has to open wound, because there has to be something down the line that it learned this and showed it to its cub, and there's some kind of pass down, right?
Well, that's the only thing that any of us can think of, is that it would have had to have been intelligent enough that it got wounded or hurt somewhere way in the past, and it would have, say, collapsed or fallen onto a bed of sphagnum moss, the right kind, and would have been intelligent enough to know that, hey, I should have not recovered from this wound. I wonder what it is about this type of green stuff here, and somehow developed a knowledge of what it was and then passed it down.
Right. And that's a significant amount of awareness.
Yeah, that's an incredible amount of intelligence for an animal to exhibit.
Because it's like, instead of just getting up and going on to either feed your belly or to go and find a female bear to fuck, you're actually going through the thinking process of, wait, I was injured. This seems to be getting better, and recognizing that this moss may have something to do with it. Like, cognitively, there is a lot going on there.
Oh, absolutely. And that's one of the things I think that there's such little awareness of today, is a lot of the things that animals do, they would have had to have learned in a very intelligent, cognizant way, and then remembered that. And not only that, but passed it down generationally. And the animal that's capable of that starts meeting some of the definitions for sentience, and it's
exactly.
It's something that most people aren't aware of, but it's definitely there. And bears, I guess, are a primary example of that.
Because I'm sure me and you know some people, human beings, that would not think that far in depth. After a bar fight in the night, they wake up, they're landed on some moss, and they're like, they're just going home, right? There's no...
Yeah, they're like, well, I guess I didn't get hit as hard as I thought I did. But
I guess there's so much socially going on that we care about that it's just such a thing we wouldn't focus on, or leave it up to the scientists, right? Because we got people to think about that. But.
Well, and that could be it. Maybe, there's a lot of stuff that's that humans concentrate on today. You've got so much going on, job, you've got to pay your bills, you've got all the dreams that you want to hopefully do, have kids, do you have kids? Right. There's so much distraction in our life, for a bear, maybe it's as simple as, their existence is just a few core things. And if something changes at one of those few core things, then that for them sticks with them profoundly.
Yeah.
So it might be easier that way.
Yeah. And I also think about, like, for human beings, if we did not have, like, you go back, let's say 15,000 years, when there wasn't a hospital down the street, it's like you're going to pay more attention to that shit. Like when you're living in the wild, essentially, or if you have, some decent huts, or if you have some form of infrastructure, but maybe not the medicine that we're used to nowadays. I think it's very much something we're just like, this wound will heal, but we're not worrying about like how bad it can get if it's like infected, because we could just go down and get
some antibiotic,
right?
Yeah, whereas you're right, 13,000 years ago, you didn't find the right kind of moss that the bears used that worked for you for an antiseptic, then you'd lose the leg, you're going to lose everything else. And I guess it's a profound change in how we live too.
Right. So I guess the lesson in these stories is bears dangerous. Also, I was just thinking, because I've been in this situation before too, the noise of a river when you're fishing, because I've fished on a river before, and if a bear's plowing through there making noise, even in the water, I've seen a grizzly across the river from me that I didn't know was there, and it was very close, and it was my sight that caught it. It wasn't anything that I heard from it, and it was making a ton of noise with his head in the water. So it's like, like the river fishing thing, it's like, how does it... sound is just out of... You're not going to hear anything down there because everything's splashing, but obviously that growl must have been pretty fucking loud if
well, yeah. You know how it is when like dusk hits, it gets that real quiet kind of we don't have we don't have crickets, but it seems like they should have been there.
Right.
But you just get that real quiet couple of hours.
So maybe it was a bit calm.
And the river, the river didn't flow fast, but you're absolutely right. Most people that get into a bad bear encounter, they're going to be somewhere near a river or stream, just because that ambient noise washes out the ability to hear.
Yeah, damn. So let's change. Let's take a turn here. Let's talk about your cultural background a bit. So what? Maybe give me an idea of that whole structure.
Sure. So my mom's Tlingit, so I grew up with her. My dad went through Vietnam. He's an Irish-Scottish guy from Arizona. He never really recuperated from that the right way. So he kind of came up to go commercial fishing in Alaska. I met my mom, but that was right after the war ended, and he never really found a way to get through it. So most of my life I grew up with my mom. She's Tlingit from Yakutat, which is just right off the coast here. And Tlingit have been here, when I was a kid, they told me 500 years. They were absolutely sure that we hadn't been here any longer. But then a couple of remains were found. They started getting into genetics, doing genetic testing, and they disproved that profoundly. Found that the Tlingit have been here for about 13,000 years in southeast Alaska, and it predates the Egyptian civilization by almost 4,000 years. And it's been, it's a culture in the world that is kind of, it's insulated. It's one of the few indigenous cultures on the planet that didn't have to struggle to survive. There's a greater concentration of edible life without the need for agriculture in Southeast Alaska than anywhere on the planet in the summertime, third in the wintertime. The winters were not harsh, even though it looks like it should be. There's a tropic warm current that comes up, and so our average wintertime temperatures are a little bit above freezing, which isn't bad.
Same as BC, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, at least where I'm from, down kind of the interior of the Kootenays and down in Vancouver area, it's kind of seems like pretty close.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, as a matter of fact, BC is a little colder than it is, even though it's almost 1,000 miles south.
Wow.
And that's just that tropic current that just locally makes it a little warmer. So it wasn't a bad place to live if you could take the 280 days of rain and constant cloud cover.
Right.
I mean, you got all 9 different types of edible clam, 5 different types of salmon, more berries in close proximity than anywhere else on the planet. So my people were rich just by location, and so didn't need to struggle, didn't need anything from anybody else. So most of our culture was spent building totem poles, complicated legal system, honor system, all based off of something similar to the samurai code. And genetics are now starting to piece together that when my people who were part of the Dene migration, which would create the Athabascans, the Navajo, the Apache, when we came across 18,000 years ago, about the same time there was a indigenous separation for the Ainu in the Japanese islands, and they came across via skin canoe. And so the combination of those two created Tlingit, which is why we can grow facial hair even at half when other Native Americans can't.
Wow, interesting. Yeah.
But our honor code was similar to feudal samurai. Honor was everything, not about individuals. Individuals would sacrifice themselves constantly for the honor and betterment of the clan as a whole. And so all of our records are written art in art form. The totem poles all track that. So growing up and then going down to visit the Plains Indians and other Indians, it was such a huge separation in cultures. It was sometimes seemed like just vastly different people when I was growing up in it.
Right, and why don't you explain a little bit what the totem pole actually symbolizes? Because I know a lot of people see totem poles in Vancouver. We got tons of them. They're beautiful. They're beautiful works of art. But most people are ignorant to exactly what it symbolizes, why certain symbols are used, why is there seems to always be, and again, this could be a bound of ignorance for me, but there always seems to be like a beak structure at the top of it, like almost like eagle, and that could be maybe just with some of them. But why don't you give us like what do you know about the history and kind of how it's viewed now?
Absolutely. So anthropomorphic representative art, which is totem poles, house screens, regalia that's worn, all that comes from Tlingit. So Tlingit were here; they built that societal structure first. The BC indigenous, West Coast indigenous, like the coastal Salish, Haida, Tsimshian, they came thousands and thousands of years later, and they were by far the less dominant people, and so they started, like any culture, adopting pieces of culture from the more dominant society and then morphing it into their own. But all of them start with the same premise. Most of the totem poles are called story poles, and they are basically written history. When missionaries first arrived, they thought that these were pagan worship sites, that these were definitely animal worship. It was dark, it was pagan, it would need to be destroyed, and they did so pretty prolifically. It took them a long time to ask what the belief in God was, and then they later would find out that we believed in one God, and all these animal crests were just written history in linear form. So for a clan, let's say it's an origin clan that had migrated down 13,000 years ago, they would have 5 or 6 totem poles in front of their clan house. Starting at the bottom, the first totem pole is the origin crest. For me, it was an albino frog. It was a story about our clan coming down to the ocean, running into the Malaspina Glacier, which extended hundreds of miles out into the interior. And 2 women sacrificed themselves trying to go underneath the glacier to find a new home because the rest were starving. And they went through an ice tunnel that should have collapsed, and on the other side found Yakutat. And they beat a drum song, and the drum song was able to resonate back through the ice to the people, and they came through. But there was an albino frog, and granted, the story is like 3 hours long when you tell it the right way.
Yeah, I hear you.
But this albino frog was sitting on a stump in front of the glacier on the Yakutat side, and it watched these women come through, didn't move, and they marveled at an albino frog. They hadn't seen one before. The rest of the people come through, and once the last person comes through, the glacier collapses behind them, and the impact and the shake of the ground causes the white frog to jump away. So what those totem pole crests are is, the first crest for me is an albino frog. And what it is it's nothing really about the animal. It's an animal that allows us and reminds us to stay symbiotic with the land that we live in. And it's the start of a story. And that would be how we migrated down, how this frog symbolized our arrival to Yakutat, in a journey that shouldn't have been possible, through a tunnel that should have collapsed, and then that animal left after watching us arrive in our new home, and that was how our history starts as a people. And then each crest after that would be another point in history that's like that. Something every 500 years that would be something that was profound, that changed those people's history and changed why we were here, how we got here. So that's what most of the poles that you're seeing are. The other poles that you have a mortuary pole where somebody that led a really great life, it didn't happen often, they would cremate you, they put your ashes in the back of a pole, and the combination of crests would tell the story of your life so that the next generation that came after could learn from you, learn why you were so great, what you'd done to be elevated to such a position. But they were built out of cedar, and yellow cedar, even though it emits an enzyme that makes it immune to rot, all of them were never maintained, so they were only allowed to live the same lifespan roughly as a human, at which point they'd fall into the forest and they'd be buried. And then the other poles you'd have were rarer. It'd be like a ridicule pole. If somebody had done something like Abraham Lincoln, they had a ridicule pole for him because somebody showed up and said he can't have slaves anymore. And so for us, if we went to war or fought with somebody else, instead of killing somebody, you would disarm them or throw them on their back and turn your back to them. And the dishonor of being disarmed and beaten but not killed was usually so great that that warrior would follow after you, and once the battle was done, would insist on being made a slave for a time they picked. They'd say, hey, I'm going to be a slave because my honor is worth 10 years and I don't want my dishonor back on my house and clan. And they would be an indentured servant for 10 years. You wouldn't have to take their life as a result. They would add to everybody's existence. They might not be all that happy with it, but after 10 years, they would leave. Oftentimes, they'd end up marrying in to the clan that they'd been a slave to. So then all of a sudden, somebody shows up and says, Abraham Lincoln says there's no more slaves. And they didn't even know they were part of the United States at that point. So they created a ridicule pole, and it had Abraham Lincoln at the top. And it was designed to show everybody that came in who saw it that, whoever this guy was had caused great shame by telling the Tlingit they couldn't do something they'd always done. Right. Those are the other poles that you have.
And do you think that was a good evolution for the culture to move away from indentured servitude, or do you think that this was a force for bad?
No, I think absolutely it was a force for good. I mean, at that point, there wasn't the need to have battles over anything. We didn't really even kill people. It was mostly just skirmishes to prove a point. Maybe one person would get injured. Problem was, if you killed somebody, then even if it was in warfare, you owed the opposite clan a life debt. And that was huge. You'd have to pay him 100 blankets, or you'd have to give him a canoe. And so people tried really hard not to actually kill each other. They just fight.
Interesting. Yeah.
And then they have some peace moderator come in on the Connie, and he'd make peace between the two sides. And so when the transition between old world living and the United States coming in took place, that was one of the things that wasn't necessary anymore. We hadn't battled or warred with each other in hundreds of years, so that was something that could change easily and should have.
Right.
And a number of indigenous cultures, especially things like shamanism, I think, were something that should have and did get replaced pretty quickly. I think the only issue that I ever had with it is that missionaries didn't focus on just a couple of pieces that were dark about a culture. They just blanketed everything. So in addition to shamans, they killed off all the medicine men. And that makes me sad because just like the bears with the sphagnum moss, it's 13,000 years of intimately being aware of a place,
right,
all the medicinal knowledge of it, and that just disappears in 10 years.
Yeah, like even so there is the medicinal knowledge, even if it's attributed to wrong things, like even if a shaman says, this thing works because of the wolf, whatever, or whatever analogy is used, even if the analogy is bullshit, because we see this in cultures all around the world. But if the medicine actually works for that property, you want to hold on to that useful information. You don't want to just abolish it because there may be some nonsense that exists.
Oh, and that's absolutely true. And the thing that I was getting at is there were actually two different positions. They were just confused by missionaries. So shamanism was just all about spiritual warfare and the spiritual plane and a lot of stuff that didn't make sense and that I don't believe in whatsoever, and most people don't today.
Okay, thanks. That's fine.
The second position we had looked similar to a shaman, but wasn't at all. It was a medicine man, and the medicine men were just healers. So their whole premise in life was to find medicinal plants to heal, but they didn't have anything to do with the spiritual side. That was all the shaman side. But when the missionaries arrived, they couldn't differentiate between the two, and so they just eradicated both. One of my favorite professors in anthropology said that we probably had the cure to cancer up until about 20 years ago, and we eliminated it because it was in some indigenous culture who's lost their language or lost their way of life, and it will take us another 1,000 years to figure out which combination of plants had that kind of healing property.
Right.
And I think that's probably one of the most important things about cultures anywhere. It's just that knowledge of living in a place for so long.
Yeah, you don't. I mean, it's such a mistake. Even when it comes to war times and conquering, it's like when you conquer another civilization, you don't want to go through killing all of the knowledgeable people. It's like that's one of the things you're trying to conquer, I think, in war times. Did the Tlingit ever go through any kind of war times? Like, was there, or has it always been peace in the history?
No, they were definitely warrioristic. To begin with, the reason why they created the two pillars of the culture, at birth from your mother's line, you're either raven or eagle. Originally, there was mostly just ravens. They're peaceful, traders, artisans, philosophers. But when other people started, like the Tsimshian and the Haida and coastal Salish, started to come down to the coast and inhabit the coast also, where before their trade lanes had been completely free. They could go where they wanted and didn't encounter many people. Now there was competition, and where there's competition, there was oftentimes, especially with language barriers, warfare, or just misunderstandings. So the Tlingit created the eagle side, which is basically the bulwark or the shield of the people. It's the warriors, and their whole premise was, and a couple of them, like the Take-Wadie and the Kagwantan wolves, the bears and the wolves, they would raid up and down the coast, and the idea was they would instill such fear in the rest of the world that the rest of the world would never try to commit war or violent acts against the Tlingit. They believed if you scared them enough to begin with, then you would never have to go to war with them after. So there was conflict, typically not much. The technology the Tlingit had, they had made full suits of armor out of Sitka spruce trees. So much so that when the Russians first showed up, they tried to conquer the Tlingit and couldn't. It almost got wiped out because their musket balls would bounce off the armor the Tlingit had. And so Baranov, who was so pivotal in Russian-American history, he came into a Yakutat when he first got to Southeast Alaska, 42 warriors. A group of Tlingit were getting out of canoe, and just like the Aleuts who the Russians had enslaved and the Lutuk who they'd enslaved, they typically would just fire a volley into a crowd, and they would prove their superiority. Well, they did this to a group of royal kids that had all had full male garb that were just becoming warriors, and when the smoke cleared, all the warriors were still standing upright because the balls had bounced off. Out of 42 warriors, I think, Baranov made it off the beach with only 2 left alive, and he took an axe wound that, if it had been a centimeter more in, would have changed Russian-American history forever.
Right.
So other cultures, indigenous cultures, didn't have anything that could stand up to that. So typically, if the Tlingit came, they either would be very peaceful, or if they had done something wrong, they would just leave supplies and a tribute on the beach, and they would evacuate their village for a day or two, just in case, and let the Tlingit roll on by. And so it was. I don't think any culture in the world was entirely peaceful.
Right. Of course.
But the Tlingit didn't have to be war-based as much, just because there was nobody that was dumb enough to do it.
Yeah, I mean, every culture's gone through modes of tribalism, and sometimes have found their way out of it and gone back to it. And I think there are still cultures nowadays that are trying to crawl out of tribalism, and it's sad that it still exists. But sometimes some of these civilizations do go to war for good reason. Resources are depleted. Or at least that's what's expected in the near future, and they need to find a new land, and sometimes peace isn't possible. And I totally I get that with humans. I mean, we are an intelligent ape, but we are still apes, and it's and we shouldn't forget that. What would be like the most important food source for the Tlingit? Like I just off the top of my head, I have to imagine that fishing would have been of high importance.
Yeah, I mean salmon by itself. I mean, there's a couple of species that run all year round. So the reason why we didn't have to war much was because we had more food than we could know what to do with.
Right.
But there was something that we did that was revolutionary that changed the rest of the world. About 7,000 years ago, Tlingit figured out how to make bentwood boxes. And cedar, which has an enzyme that makes them immune to rot, it's anathema to bugs. They would warp with steam this complete box, and they'd fit a panel in the bottom, and this panel would lock in so that it was airtight. But then they would put slats in the top that had air vents, and they would steam in a lid, but inside it would be pinniped oil, harbor seal or sea lion. It's one of the perfect, most nutritious preservatives in nature. They would put some salmon, berries, all kinds of different deer or food in there, When they heated the box, it was to a high degree. The top lid would seal in, but it was done so that if you re-steamed it, you could pull it back off again. And the reason why it was revolutionary is because it was the same process as jarring or canning something. So you could put something in a box, food-wise, put it into oil like Harbor Seal or Sea Lion, and you could seal it. You could reopen that lid without refrigerating it 5 years later, and the food would still be good. The French didn't figure out how to do that until the late 1700s. So we had what were called grease trails, like the Chilkat Trail, which is so iconic in the gold rush. We would trade these boxes of food one way to the people of the interior that had harsh winters where they'd lose half a village some years. They would trade all their worldly possessions, all their treasures and resources and ores, just for these boxes of food that for the first time allowed them to have a bad winter and not lose, a whole bunch of their loved ones. And it was something that changed the world, just having food readily available.
Yeah.
In order to make that happen, I'd have to say the most important food for us, aside from salmon, was harbor seal and sea lion because of that oil.
Right.
It was profound how much of an impact it had.
Okay, we have to cut the episode there, but we got to do, obviously, I think we got like 4 more episodes to do here. I think we have lots of time. But anyways, Lee, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it. I look forward to speaking with you more.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Travis, for letting me be out here. And I haven't had a chance to do something like this on a cruise ship before, and so it's a lot of fun.
Awesome. All right, well, thank you everyone for tuning in. This has been the Pangburn Podcast, and let art and science inspire.